I'm going to begin with my first ever Rev Reads disclaimer. I am not an expert on the Church Fathers. I have never read the writings of Jerome outside of quotations in other works. I've only ever read Augustine's Confessions and a couple of other letters. I have read Pelagius's commentary on Romans, which, interesting enough, is not used as a source in the book Myth of Pelagianism because it has probably been edited to such an extent that we don't know which words were those of Pelagius or those who came after him. Now, I've read many of the Church Fathers, just not much of Jerome, Augustine, or Pelagius. So my review should simply be taken as my take on Ali Bonner's work, The Myth of Pelagianism, while noting that I am not in a position to judge the accuracy of her work, and I have no interest to dive into the writings of Pelagius and Augustine or Jerome to see if she has taken them out of context or distorted their views in any way. After reading this book and Pelagius's commentary on Romans, I have had enough of Pelagius to last a lifetime. And here's the simple reason that I don't care to go any deeper into Pelagius. Pelagius was an ascetic, and I have no love for the ascetic movement. I see it as a corruption on the biblical teaching on sanctification and Christian living. I believe that it led to some terrible teaching and practices in the church, so I don't want to waste any more of my time defending an ascetic leader beyond this review. Therefore, my review should also not be seen as an endorsement on any of Pelagius's views. This is just a presentation of the arguments of Ali Bonner's The Myth of Pelagianism based on my reading of her work. With that out of the way, here's the review. Ali Bonner presents a thorough and compelling argument that Pelagius may have been the victim of the worst smear campaign in church history, one that was so effective and so thorough that an innocent man is still unquestionably held as a heretic 1,600 years later. And far from being heretical, the views of Pelagius's writings are in line with mainstream asceticism from his days. Therefore, Augustine led what was a sinful and divisive attack against Pelagius while being helped along the way by Jerome, who it appears may have followed Augustine in order to save his own skin, and at least in Bonner's book was probably the most despicable character of all. Here's Bonner's theory as I took it. Augustine desired to move church orthodoxy in a new direction based on his understandings of Scripture. He wanted all grace to be seen as prevenient. No grace comes as a result of human effort or a reward for human working, but it must first come from God. And no human can do anything good at all without God's grace acting in their hearts first. Second, the teaching of divine predestination. All those who are saved are only saved by the eternal decree and election of God. God's election enables man's belief and salvation through faith. Third, original sin. Man is born in Adam's guilt and incapable of coming to Christ for salvation without predestination and prevenient grace first working in his life. Augustine wanted all Christians to live in a house that is built upon these doctrines and teachings that he held so dear. But Augustine had a problem. His problem was the movement of asceticism, the movement where self-denial of earthly comforts was seen to bring about spiritual. Interestingly enough, the one place where Pelagius disagreed with Paul when he wrote his commentary on Romans, it was in Romans chapter 14. It was where Paul referred to the strong Christian as the one who eats meat, and the weak one is the one who eats vegetables only. While an ascetic Christian would say, hey, if you eat meat, you're the weaker one, and if you fast, if you only eat vegetables, you are stronger. And therefore, he disagreed with Paul in that chapter. Other ascetics who Ali Bonner brings out as Athanasius, St. Anthony in the desert, Jerome, and others, they lived in a doctrinal house that was similar to what Pelagius viewed. They lived in a doctrinal house built upon views of human free will, a belief in inherent human goodness. Yes, mankind are sinners, but they are also good by nature in spite of having sin in their lives, since they are made in the image of God. Finally, predestination according to foreknowledge. God chose those whom he knew would one day believe upon him in the future, so God's predestination was working in line with man's free will. Now, what Augustine wanted to do was to get people out of the ascetic house and the ascetic beliefs and bring them into his house of divine determinism, and he found the perfect tool to do so in Pelagius. Why Pelagius? He was an outsider who was also an ascetic. Pelagius was from the cold lands of the north in Britain. And if Augustine could paint Pelagius as a heretic, he could draw others away from commonly held ascetic views that would instead get them to be lined closer to Augustine. So Augustine, along with the help of Jerome, began an almost obsessive smear campaign against Pelagius the outsiders and those who were closely associated to him. Bonner shows that nearly all the tenets of Pelagianism were either denied by Pelagius himself or contradicted in Pelagius's own letters. So based on Pelagius's testimony, based on Pelagius's writings, Pelagius didn't even follow Pelagianism. Augustine himself wrote, "It may be doubtful or unclear whether Pelagius or Celestius, or both of them, or neither of them, or others either with them or in their name, held or still hold such positions." So Augustine himself lacked proof that Pelagius was a Pelagian. And after they condemned the list of teachings that were labeled as Pelagian, any person who associated with Pelagius were smeared as being men of pride and arrogance for their denial of deterministic predestination and prevenient grace. Here's the thing. I think Bonner makes a quality argument that Pelagius didn't invent any new teachings. None of the views in his writings were novel, but they were shared by Athanasius and others in the ascetic movement. I think she could have spent a little bit less time on St. Anthony of the desert and spread out the similarities of Pelagius to a lot more other ascetic writers. But she does make a convincing case that if Pelagius is a heretic, then so is Anthony of the desert and Athanasius. But Augustine couldn't attack those men as heretics because they were viewed as above reproach. He also couldn't bring his views into the church to stand on their own merit because they were too novel in comparison to a lot of the other views at the time, especially the views held in the ascetic movement. Instead, Augustine needed to work by distraction. And he needed to slip in his own teaching during that distraction, and the distraction that he used was declaring Pelagius, the Brit from the north, as a heretic. I think there's a lot to say from this book about suspected underhanded motivations of Augustine, but I think the most scathing attack in this book is actually against Jerome. The reason is that Jerome was an ascetic like Pelagius. Jerome held many of the same views as Pelagius. Jerome even held several views in a more extreme way that lined up with so-called Pelagianism than Pelagius himself. So who knows why Jerome attacked someone who held so closely to his own views? Maybe Jerome went through a spiritual change and tried desperately to move away from previous views he had earlier in his life. Maybe Jerome was fearful that he would be accused of arrogance as well, and so he tried to distance himself from Pelagius as strongly as possible. Whatever the reason, Bonner had an entire chapter filled with quotes from Jerome that sounded a lot more Pelagian than the writings of Pelagius. Jerome wrote on Pharaoh's heart being hardened based on foreknowledge. Jerome wrote that children are unstained until they have first committed sin. Jerome wrote in back-to-back sentences that the only reason we can be saved is because of God's will and God's election, and then in the next sentence wrote that the only reason we're saved is because of our own human free will. Jerome stigmatized riches as immoral and taught on the goodness of human nature, and also on man's ability in this life to reach perfection if you will first sell all of your goods and give them to the poor. Now, there's more that I'd like to say on this book, such as how Pelagius's letters were mistaken as those written by Augustine and Jerome throughout church history because Pelagius's letters sounded like the early views of Augustine and Jerome. I'd love to talk about how eternal rewards fits into all of this and Augustine's terrible understanding of grace. But I don't want to take up that much of your time today. I'll just end with this. Bonner makes a thorough and convincing case that if you want to label Pelagius as a heretic, you should also label many, many other church fathers as heretics as well. And I gotta say, I disagree with Pelagius on a bunch of stuff, but I also see the idea of him being a heretic as a little ridiculous. I think this is a powerful illustration of how much damage deceit and lying can do. 1,600 years later, and rare is the person who ever questions, was Pelagius really Pelagian? Is he really a heretic? People in the church are still smeared as being semi-Pelagian, when in reality, no group may have ever existed at all. And if a group did, it was most of the ascetic church fathers, which is a huge group of people and also includes many beloved early church fathers. And in my opinion, if you want to label somebody as Pelagian, they must have views of asceticism in their life. And I never hear anybody bring that up when they're talking about Pelagian. I think anyone who wants to call another person Pelagian or semi-Pelagian without first reading Pelagius's letters and commentaries that bear his name, you're doing so in ignorance. And Bonner's thorough scholarship should be the beginning of a re-examination of Pelagius and how he was labeled a heretic so many years ago. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts and comments below on this review. And if you're someone who is insistent on seeing Pelagius as a heretic, I'm just curious if you've read Pelagius's writings before and compared them with his contemporaries to see that they are truly out of step with mainline Christianity and don't line up with the views of other church fathers of those days. Have you seen how he is sharply portrayed as a heretic in his own writings? And if you're new to the Rev Reads channel, you've enjoyed this review, maybe it got your blood pumping a little bit stronger, I would love for you to subscribe to the Rev Reads YouTube channel. And for those who want to support the channel and become a patron, you can go to patreon.com/Rev